Good afternoon. I'm happy to see people here on this glorious spring day. So thank you for joining us. We're here to celebrate and discuss the Routledge Companion to Gender and COVID-19, this amazing book by my colleagues Aziza Ahmed and Linda McClain. So I'm Jessica Silby. I am the Dean of Intellectual Life at the law school. I am always very uncomfortable when I say that out loud. The job is to foster conversations such as these we will be having today and to discuss and encourage impactful scholarship such as this amazing book. The tradition of book celebrations here at BU Law started several academic deans ago. It's a wonderful tradition, and I'm really proud to be continuing it. So early this year, just so if people are curious, we had a book event for faculty who write novels, actually. It was a wonderful, very fun, very different from today, because of course today we're not talking about fiction. We are talking about something very real that has impacted all of our lives, which is the COVID pandemic. So BU Law, as many people probably know, but I like saying out loud over and over, has one of the top-ranked health law programs in the country. And we are also now the home of a brand new and exciting program on reproductive justice, where two of our co-directors are here, Professors McClain and Ahmed, and Nicole Huberfeld is a third co-director. Both Professor Ahmed and McClain teach and write in the areas of gender and law, constitutional law, and human rights, and in Professor Ahmed's case, also health law and science. So the partnership then, the co-authored partnership for this book is really quite a dream team. And I'm really very excited to hear what our guests and the co-editors have to say about it. So two of our contributors are here in person, Maya Mannion and Jackie Dugard. They're here with us to talk about their work on the project and the project as a whole. And then Matiange Sirleaf will be online. She's our third guest as part of an expert in the field to join us in the conversation. So for people who want to look at the book, it's available through the BU libraries online and in print. There are 35 chapters to this book. Including our colleague Naomi Mann, who's not here but contributed to it, and many more themes we'll talk about today. So sub-themes, for example, family and communities, economic labor and social reproduction is a sub-theme in the book, reproductive health, politics and leadership, among many others. It's a very, very rich compendium of excellent interventions on the area of gender and COVID-19. Very comprehensive, very readable, and so I think we're in for a treat. So this is how I propose we pass our time together. I will introduce our guests and my colleagues as well. Then Professor McClain and Ahmed will briefly introduce the project, and then we will go in order from my right all the way up, and Matiange will have the last word for the formal program, and then we will have a conversation. So let me, with pleasure, introduce our guests from out of town. So Jackie Dugard, who's furthest to my right here, is a senior lecturer at the Institute of the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. She's also a visiting professor of law at Wits University at Johannesburg, where she was an associate professor from 2014 to 2022. She is a socio-legal scholar, and she works on sustainable equality with a focus on socioeconomic rights, land, and climate justice. Maya Mannion is a professor of law and the faculty director of the Health Law and Policy Program at American University, Washington College of Law. Her scholarship investigates the relationship between constitutional law, family law, and healthcare law, with a particular focus on access to reproductive health care. She presents widely on abortion rights and has authored numerous law journal articles and book chapters on that subject. She's also currently a PhD candidate in medical sociology at the University of California, San Francisco. Very impressive. Professor Matiange Sirleaf is an interdisciplinary international scholar, justice seeker, and award-winning author who has worked to unearth unjust hierarchies embedded in international law and to remedy the inequities that emerge and persist. She is the Nathan Patz Professor of Law at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. She holds a secondary appointment as a professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And now for the co-editors of this book, my colleagues here at BU. So Aziza Ahmed is Professor of Law and the N. Neil Pike Scholar at BU School of Law. She's the author of a forthcoming book called Risk and Resistance: How Feminists Transform the Law and Science of AIDS, coming out in September 2025. So I guess we will have another book celebration coming soon. And with Linda McClain and Nicole Huberfeld, she co-founded and co-directs the program on reproductive justice here at BU. Linda McClain is the Robert Kent Professor of Law at Boston University and co-director of the BU program on reproductive justice. She writes and teaches in the area of family law, gender in the law, feminist legal theory, and particularly as they intersect with constitutional law and civil rights law. She is the author of many books, most recently, Who's the Bigot? Learning from Conflicts Over Marriage and Civil Rights from Oxford University Press in 2020. And with that, I will leave it to our co-editors and the people we're celebrating today.
Thank you. I want to thank people who are attending this event in person as well as online, and that includes, I believe, my mother. So shout out to Marilyn McLean West. And I want to thank Jessica for organizing this program, and to our three panelists, Maya and Jackie, for doing double duty of not only contributing to the book, but also for coming today, and to Mattia and Gay for participating, and also for her kind endorsement of the book. If you look at the flyer, you'll see a nice blurb from her. And thanks to Naomi Mann for contributing a terrific chapter on the promise and perils of the turn during the pandemic to Zoom Court, particularly gender and class-based perils. She's in a very important hearing right now and can't be here. And of course, thanks to Aziza for working with me on what turned out to be quite a big project. And a huge thanks to Stephanie Weigman, BU Law Librarian, whose help in identifying the relevant work and potential contributors to this volume was really invaluable. And thanks to the Dean for research support, and staff members, Joseph Boudreau Graham, who was, when he was an SPC, Senior Program Coordinator, helped me keep track of the book's many moving parts. Several present or former BU law students help with research and site checking: Amanda Baird, Jordan Boyle, Madison Harris Parks, Francine Alexandre, and Mariel LaBerge. Thanks to Jim Fleming for his support, even though he strongly urged me never to do another edited book. This was my third. This project began in early January 2021 when the editor of the Gender Studies list at Routledge wrote to me because she'd seen a forthcoming law review article that I wrote with Naomi Kahn, Gendered Complications of COVID-19 Toward a Feminist Recovery Plan. And this was since published in Georgetown Journal of Gender and Law. And the editor wanted to commission an edited volume with between 30 and 40 chapters that would be a starting point for interdisciplinary research on issues relating to COVID and gender that would be international as well as intersectional. And I was cautious since I had edited 2 previous books, and I know how much work that can be. In a Zoom call, the editor, Alexander McCall, told me it was common to have a co-editor on such a large project, and made the case that a reason to do the book was that it was clear very early on that there were significant gender dynamics related to the pandemic, and some of which you'll hear about today. And I had a high opinion of Routledge because even though I'd never published with a non-university press, they have a lot of good books. I'd contributed to a few anthologies in feminist legal theory. I'd used a lot of their books in literary studies and gender studies. So anyway, so I invited Aziza because of her expertise in public health and gender, as well as her work in the forthcoming book Jessica mentioned, Risk and Resistance on Feminism, Medicine, and HIV. And we wanted the book to explore the links between prior epidemics, such as HIV, the COVID pandemic, and lessons for future pandemics. And Jessica's already told you the sections, around which the book is organized. We end up with over 60 authors from multiple disciplines, many of whom co-authored. Sometimes we had as many as 4 or 5 authors on one chapter, who investigated the pandemic's impact in many different legal and political systems. And we knew some of the contributors, but some we met only through working conferences on Zoom with them where people shared their drafts, and some we have not yet met in person at all. So working on this book during the second year of the pandemic and beyond, we saw the relevance of the feminist phrase, the personal is political, as contributors experienced in their own lives some of the stresses about which they were writing. The impact of the pandemic and stay-at-home orders on individuals, families, and community life, how the pandemic made the care crisis worse, and its negative impacts on sexual and reproductive health and healthcare. As we worked on the book, initial drafts, revised drafts, the whole editing process with Routledge, some of our authors struggled with COVID, either themselves or their family members. Aziza had her second child during the first surge of COVID and navigated the challenges of parenting, the care crisis, and school closures. On a personal note myself, my first pandemic travel was to visit my father, Robert McClain, who contracted COVID and died several weeks later. So that was sort of a personal way in the pandemic came home to me, and that's why I dedicated the book to him. But anyway, 5 years after the pandemic began and 4 years after we began this project, we're very grateful to be here today to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much to all of you all for being here. I wanted to especially thank Maya, Jackie, and Matiange for being a part of this volume. All of our contributors today are living at the cusp of all the political issues that are going on. So I know it's a lot to take the time to take a moment to reflect and think about these issues when you feel like you're supposed to be doing stuff all the time. Thank you, Jessica, for planning this event. You have a lot on your plate. And thank you to Linda for inviting me to join this project. I'm always learning from Linda's focus and resolve. And, you might have noticed that Linda is prolific and you might have wondered how she does it. And now I know. I'm not sure I'll ever be as productive, but I was grateful to have that experience to work with you, Linda. And also my parents are watching, so hi, assuming they got the Zoom link to work. We decided that I should maybe say a few things about public health and how our volume relates to public health. And so I'm just going to take a minute to situate it. I really think this edited volume is important because it speaks to a core issue in the context of disease response, which is gender. And in addition to gender, our book, of course, takes on other factors shaping the COVID response and dynamics that emerge from that response. It includes race, poverty, sexuality, structural inequalities, especially those between global North and global South, that contribute to disease outcomes. To add gender, race, or structural inequality to any project on public health builds on a core sensibility that public health is inherently political. And it challenges the idea that the spread of disease and the response to disease is apolitical, technical, or neutral, that the consequences are the natural consequences of a virus sort of traveling through society as opposed to one that is made by people. So despite this being on profound display during the pandemic, we saw this with lower rates of vaccinations among people of color, women dropping out of the workforce, female caregivers who are largely migrants contracting COVID, meatpacking workers contracting and dying from COVID, many of whom were migrant laborers as well. Much of this is discussed in our volume, and I could go on and on. April 2025, this month, finds the administration trafficking in the notion of herd immunity, ignoring the social, economic, and political backdrop that leads individuals to being vulnerable in the first place. This idea took hold during COVID. The idea of herd immunity and that we ought to let viruses sort of progress naturally through society. It appeared in the Great Barrington Declaration, and the authors are now leaders of all our public health institutions, including the key author, Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the head of the National Institutes for Health. So even as we worry about bird flu, we're on the cusp of a resurgence of HIV/AIDS cases. Still today, 18% of the South African population test positive for HIV. In the United States, 1 in 2 gay Black men will be diagnosed with HIV in his lifetime. And girls aged 13 to 19 constitute the majority of new AIDS cases. In the face of this data, the US government, the largest supporter in aid, care, and provision of bilateral and multilateral assistance, is in the process of shuttering all funding and programming on AIDS globally. So to declare a pandemic over, I'll just say, is as much as a political act as an act of epidemiological reality. The World Health Organization pronounced the COVID pandemic over on May 5th, 2023. Of course, we don't live in a world where bodies are piled up anymore in freezers outside, but the virus continues to travel from persons to person. Some newspapers continue to publish weekly death counts. Most of the world remains unvaccinated, and many people continue to fall sick. In January 2024, a New York Times article announced that scientists see a diminished threat in the newest surge of COVID cases. And the article had a quote, "We're in good shape," is what an expert on COVID reassured readers. But a few paragraphs later, the article offers a statistic without comment: 1,200 people die of COVID each week. So even as the story is rewritten as one of biological neutrality, as though it's a state of nature that we're just going to have 1,200 people dying every week, you know, of course, we understand that the number 1,200 and the deaths to come with the closure and denial of HIV services or lack of planning from bird flu are the consequences and outcomes of legal and political choices we're making. So I'm grateful to our authors for pausing with us to try to understand how to make sense of all of these dynamics, especially through the lens of gender, for producing a volume that I hope will help at least contribute somehow to setting the agenda for dealing with all the public health crises that we're currently careening towards.
I think we're gonna
Jack.
Jack
Oh,
first.
Jack. Okay, thanks.
Do you
Do
want
I-
to sit at
Oh,
the
I should
podium?
stand there.
Yeah, why don't you go to the podium?
Can we just confirm that people watching online can now see everybody?
Yeah, I think we fixed the problem about being
Okay.
online, yeah. But I just want to make sure, yeah. The
Yeah.
podium is being, yeah. right.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for this invitation, and also really to Aziza and to Linda for including me and my co-authors in this amazing book. I was thinking about reflecting on what to say over this book launch, and I've seen in many academic circles and activist circles, people are thinking we shouldn't really talk about COVID anymore. We don't want to think about it. Let's just forget about that difficult time. And I have been thinking more and more about how relevant it is and how exceptionally important it is to think about COVID, and to think about COVID as a curtain raiser for the global challenges that we are facing, the entwined challenges of rising inequality, of climate insecurity and catastrophe, of governance problems, of authoritarianism, etc. And I think COVID really gave us a sense of how precarious the systems we've built are, and how right Nancy Fraser is in her astonishing book on cannibal capitalism, where she brings all of this together so importantly to essentially show us that the snake of this hegemonic system, or we shall not say hegemonic because that suggests no resistance, but the dominant system of global capitalism, what it has bequeathed on us. And I wanted to bring it back to the COVID pandemic. I wanted to read to you what Arundhati Roy wrote in April 2020 in a piece that was widely published called "The Pandemic is a Portal." She said, "Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than to return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Sadly, we walk through the portal the wrong way. And I think we find ourselves now having to confront this exact same reality that Arundhati Roy spoke about. And I want to say that I think this is a moment to look at the chapters in this book, to reflect on how we can build a new portal, construct a new world order, abandon the dead carcasses, the dead ideas, the exclusion, the marginalization, the inequality of the current system. And I wanted to focus in particular on a couple of the chapters, but I think they are all highly relevant. So, for example, and the obvious thing to state here is that much of the COVID crisis, just as the current, what I call patriarchal colonial capitalism, but Nancy Fraser just calls cannibal capitalism, much of the impact and the drivers are gendered. And of course, the chapters of this book focus on that very much. So we can look at chapter 32, for example, which I found a really fascinating chapter. It's entitled Women's Leadership is Associated with Fewer COVID-19 Deaths and Better Communication. And in this chapter, it's a survey of how countries with women leaders fared better with fewer deaths during the COVID pandemic. The authors hypothesize it has to do with the way women leaders communicate, much more in terms of collective framing than individual defensiveness, etc. But we might point out as feminists that this could really be a call to what feminist leadership may be about. And I think this is a really important point for us all to continue to work on. What is feminist leadership beyond mere, and I'm not discounting this, but beyond representation per se? What do we mean when we talk about feminist leadership? And this chapter is some very interesting ideas from a statistical quantitative perspective on the correlations between women leadership, political leadership, and fewer deaths in COVID, which I think is highly instructive as we build a new portal. Then I looked at chapter 4, which has the interesting title of We Are Not in This Together. And this points to the failures of attempts to ring fence, have women's budgets in particular as an add-on, and calls for a feminist reconceptualization of budgets. Now, we may go further and say a feminist reconception of the economy. And I think, this does also link to many of the challenges today on trying to identify what a feminist economic system would look like, how it would focus on care, how it would focus on rights, how it would focus on needs and capabilities and raise money around that rather than the other way around, thinking about this is how much money we've got. Oh, we can't afford X, Y, and Z because, for example, we allow so much accumulation of wealth, etc. And then chapter 35 is the chapter that I myself was a co-author on, and there we looked at vaccine apartheid, and we looked at the fact that in a divided world between global north and global south, the huge gendered impact of the inability of global south countries to access in time COVID vaccines and care, and how this really showed up the priorities of our system based on intellectual property rights and profit over the right to health and equity. And I'll just finish by saying that I think that not only giving us some ideas about where we might go currently, I think the book is a call, really, to reimagine our systems, to think about a better way to move forward. And I think that human rights are part of this portal, radical human rights, which are focused on equality and access and realizing people's capabilities. I think this is a key part. And I also think we're going to unfortunately have to get rid of nation states, which are absolutely clearly part of the problem. And we might actually have to, let me be really controversial for a moment, we might have to rethink family and property as Engels warned us. Thank you.
I'm here for it. All right. Here for it.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you so much to Linda and Aziza for inviting me to join the conversation today and to be a part of this wonderful book. Thanks to Jessica and my co-panelists. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with all of you. It's hard for me to believe it's been 5 years since the start of the COVID-19 lockdowns. It feels like a world away. But as you were all saying, we are living in the world that has flown from everything, we have experienced in the pandemic. And I love that portal metaphor because I really feel like we walked through that portal into a dystopian new world rather than the more utopian world that this book tries to envision and lead us towards. So as we're all still processing and living through the aftermath of the pandemic, this book really provides crucial insights into how to understand how the pandemic has reshaped our society around the globe and how it both exposed and exacerbated inequality along lines of gender. That's what's centered in the book. But of course, it's not just about gender. The book also gives us lots of data, lots of information about how gender intersects with race, class, ability, immigration status, et cetera. And I think what is unique about this volume that Linda and Aziza have put together so painstakingly is that it contains both breadth and depth of analysis. And the book brings such a wide lens across disciplines, methodologies, theoretical frameworks, and geographies in terms of the places of study, and all while achieving their goal of informing how we can better prepare for future pandemics in ways that can hopefully rectify the inequalities that we all witnessed and are witnessing. So my comments will focus on part 5 of the book, which includes 7 chapters on reproductive health. And just this segment of the book illustrates why this volume is essential reading for researchers and advocates interested in gender equity post-pandemic. So part 5 on reproductive health reflects in microcosm the book's breadth and depth of analysis and wide disciplinary and geographic scope. It has topics covering telehealth abortion and abortion pills, both during and after the pandemic, disability justice in the context of reproductive health care, conservative religious resistance to reproductive rights, and all of this in places from the US to India. And that global comparative perspective is interesting to see across the whole book, but also very interesting to see just in this one topic on reproductive health. So the chapter I contributed is mainly an overview. It summarizes the Dobbs decision. It provides an overview of what we're seeing now, different states across the US, criminalizing abortion care. In Texas, the sentence is life imprisonment, and we now have our first criminal prosecution against a healthcare provider, a midwife. Civil liability bounty hunter laws. Texas, again, was at the forefront of this. They enacted SB 8 in the height of the pandemic, so it forced, during the pandemic, pregnant patients to travel out of state for abortion care and risk exposure to the virus. And of course, it was that launch of attacks on abortion rights in the pandemic that set the stage for both the explosion of legal conflict around abortion that we're seeing today and for the public health fallout from the Dobbs decision. And the book and the various chapters in this section gives us a lot of data on who is most impacted by restrictions on reproductive health care. And we know, of course, it is the most marginalized people. So the various chapters in this book explore all of these issues in greater depth, and it provides much more in-depth insight on the work that needs to be done to advance reproductive health equity, especially for vulnerable populations post-COVID. One of the interesting things to note about the Dobbs decision is when you read the opinion, the majority opinion just dismisses any public health concerns, right? The court just doesn't care about public health as a weighty constitutional concern. And that was true not only in the abortion context, but as other chapters discussed, right, throughout many different issues in the pandemic, around pandemic era lockdowns and other regulations. So Elizabeth Sepper's chapter on gender, religion, and COVID does a wonderful job exploring this issue in much greater depth, and in particular on how the court has elevated religious freedom claims, particularly of conservative Christians, above all other rights and all other government interests, including public health and gender equity. And that chapter also, for all of you interested in constitutional law and what's happening with the religion clauses at the U.S. Supreme Court, is just a wonderful, concise and clear description of the trends in the Supreme Court's religion jurisprudence and how that right is being elevated for certain groups of people anyway, against all other kinds of interests. Robin Powell's chapter on reproductive justice for disabled people during COVID-19 also focuses on equality concerns and provides really extensive data on how intersecting oppressions impact people with disabilities, and in particular in their access to the whole spectrum of reproductive health care. So her chapter uses the reproductive justice framework and the three pillars of reproductive justice: the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent your children in safety, and shows across these different pillars how people with disabilities in the United States face discrimination and systemic barriers in accessing care, not just abortion and contraception, but also in being able to have safe childbirth and raise their children. And it was interesting to see, her chapter, which focuses on the United States and the barriers faced by marginalized people there. And that chapter really resonates with Jayashree Satpate's chapter on the impact of COVID-19 on the reproductive rights of marginalized women in India. And it was really interesting seeing this contrast between the US and India. India has some restrictions on abortion, but certainly not a ban, nothing like the kinds of restrictions we're seeing post-Dobbs in the US. But it's also interesting to see that regardless of legal regime, right, we also have to think beyond the law, and what the law looks like on the ground. And Satpate's chapter shows through these very heart-wrenching and compelling case studies of marginalized women in India and the challenges they face in getting access to safe childbirth, particularly for low-income and rural women in India. With regard to access to abortion care in particular, this part of the book also shows how all the different facets of healthcare policy, whether it's abortion legislation, court decisions, or just healthcare infrastructure, obstruct access to equitable abortion care across the globe, all right? So not just in the US, but again, it's interesting to compare India. Deepika Jain and Kritika Balu's chapter specifically talks about access to abortion in India in COVID-19. And it was quite striking to see India did the exact opposite as some US states. During COVID-19, India actually declared family planning and abortion as essential health services during the COVID-19 pandemic, while in the US, conservative states said abortion is not an essential health service, and therefore we need to shut down the abortion clinics. So you have these conflicting legal regimes, yet again, on the ground, there were still structural and some legal barriers to access to abortion in India, especially for the most vulnerable populations. The lockdowns in India were quite severe and still made it very challenging to access care, despite the fact that the government had declared it an essential service. There's also two really interesting chapters on telehealth abortion and abortion pills, obviously hugely important now in the post-Roe era. As for many people, it's the only way to have a chance at accessing abortion care. And these two chapters illustrate how the book uses different methodological approaches to sort of take a look at one issue from many different kinds of angles. So Rebecca Ralston's chapter explores how the pandemic's instigation of telehealth as a normal mode of healthcare greatly expanded access to abortion care, at least early in pregnancy, where abortion pills can be used safely and effectively. And Rachel Rebouche's chapter, which she calls The Resilience of Reproductive Rights, contrasts how, well, on the one hand, some states banned abortion completely during the pandemic. They sort of leveraged the pandemic to pursue an anti-abortion agenda. There were other legal and policy levers that other actors were able to use to expand telehealth abortion in the US. And so it was actually during the pandemic and after Biden was elected that the FDA finally changed some of its restrictions on abortion pills so that no-touch telehealth abortion became possible. I'm just sort of waiting for the shoe to drop on that now. Don't know when that's going to change. But what I really like about Rachel's chapter is she really shows how, the pandemic were such dark times in many ways, but it also spurred an incredible amount of change, right? Technologically in healthcare. It spurred on technological and legal developments that have really changed the face of abortion access, right? Even post-obs, there's some striking data. Post-obs, the number of abortions in the US went up. And there's a lot of different factors around that. And telehealth abortion is certainly one of them. So of course, now we're in a world where we continue to face serious threats to reproductive rights and justice, to public health, to the rule of law, to democracy under the current Trump administration. And the seeds of all of this were planted during the pandemic. But this book has such important lessons, I think, to help us get through these times. It gives us theoretical frames, methods, guiding questions for future research and advocacy. And I think it's really important to see from this book that we can remain resilient even in the face of these very powerful threats to public health and to human and civil rights. So thank you so much for putting this together.
Fabulous. So now Professor Matyange Sirleaf should be on the screen.
Here, I hope you all can hear me.
Yeah, but we want to be able to see you first, so let's see if we can get you.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. We see you now.
I was like, okay. Well, thank you all for your efforts. I mean, this is an incredible feat, and I don't know if it's a pleasure, but having served in an editorial role before, I have to really commend you all for your efforts. I mean, it's really Herculean. And thinking about just the range of authors that you all have gathered, the fact that there are 35 chapters spanning multiple countries and giving gender analysis as sort of the central organizing frame and sort of uplifting an important aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic that in some ways we should have known, but in some ways has been obscured from view. And so what I love about the volume in total is that it brings to the surface things that we had suspected, but gives us a method and tools to sort of like dig deeper and understand them. And so I'm grateful to you all for assembling such a prodigious group of contributors and giving us an ability to sort of read these texts together to try to understand the impact that COVID-19 has and continues to have, right? And one of the things that I think is important as I was reading through the different chapters, that we are not in this together is, just a perfect title, but also too is a perfect way of thinking about the pandemic as a portal, as has been referenced, because it points out the lie of solidarity and the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic, which some thought was going to be, this great leveler, your work and your volume shows the ways in which it most very much was not the great leveler. And in fact, that we were not in some instances even experiencing the same storm and certainly not in the same raft. Some were in boats that were yachts, some were in dinghies, some were like holding on to life preservers, life jackets, and some people were drowning and are still drowning in the storm. And so what I love about the volume is that it gives us an opportunity to sort of think about the various ways that the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced us and society. And the chapter from Jamie Moodud is insightful because it gives us an opportunity to think about money as a tool of governance, and money as a tool of legal governance is the phrase that's used in the chapter. And it is a powerful one because it helps us to think about the gendered way in which national budgets are structured, and the particularly masculine ways in which budgets are structured in ways that are invisibilized. And the ways in which our national budgets do not reflect an ethos of care in any shape or form, particularly sitting in the United States. But for a moment, we were able to see what a budget that was structured around care might do. Because of the expansion of the pandemic social safety net, things that we have been told were not possible in terms of protecting our health and our well-being were seemingly politically feasible overnight in terms of thinking about the accessibility of tests for free, vaccinations for free, the construction of material supports that allowed for rent and eviction moratoriums, the freezing of student debt, paying for childcare subsidies, and then seemingly, a very short time, a more robust care care budget was structured. And we saw child poverty rates fall. We saw poverty rates fall overall in the US. And then within a blink of an eye, seemingly, we also saw that expansion of the safety net was dismantled one by one. And one of the things that I love about this chapter, We Are Not in This Together, is that it surfaces the ways in which our current budget is structured in ways that prioritize defense spending, the military above all else, and how this impacts our health and well-being, right? And so it makes it very clear that poverty is a choice, and sort of to the extent that we have both the gender of COVID and the color of COVID-19, we're able to see the policy choices that create gendered effects of COVID-19 and policy choices that exacerbate racialized impacts of COVID-19. And the volume allows us to reflect on our current material reality and think about what feminist perspectives bring to this. And thinking about drawing on feminist theory, social reproduction theory, in particular the chapter from Saru, which is thinking about Martha Feynman's work on vulnerability theory and others' work in terms of social reproduction theory, and thinking about how the state reproduces its economic order through using women as sort of soldiers. The chapter uses a metaphor of soldiers in doing this unpleasant work of caregiving that is not compensated in any way, but then the risk that are felt by women in terms of risk to safety and life chances is also not compensated, right? So there's a gendered labor of care where women in particular are sort of on the front lines. And so how do we think about this? And one of the things that I love about the volume is that it also does work of trying to destabilize our understanding of binary understanding of male and female roles, about care work, who's required to do care work, and the like. And in particular, the chapter on gender and human rights in the context of COVID-19 has this powerful framework of text, pretext, and context of gender and COVID-19, which helps us to see how gender serves as both text as well as pretext for other ends that the state wants to achieve, and also can provide context. And one of the things that this chapter does, which is really powerfully look at the ways of stereotypical understandings of gender about who does what in different countries, for example, looking at Peru or Panama, and thinking about how gender is used as a tool for social control. And that this is evidence in policymaking, but also to how LGBTQ plus people end up being used as sort of a pretext for social control, because, for example, in Uganda, there are efforts to restrict social gatherings because it's happening during electoral season. And so this gendered analysis allows us to see things that we might not otherwise see. It helps us to disrupt notions that need troubling in terms of the gender binary. At the same time, there are pieces that can tend to reify the binary in terms of thinking about women's leadership. Here I'm thinking about the chapter on women's leadership as somehow being better because it's like the women themselves. And so I worry about sort of essentializing gender and using sort of stereotypical ways of thinking about gender. And I think because the volume is so, does so much, the reward for good work is, you want more. And so I don't know if you all are thinking about doing a second volume, and maybe you're not because you're still in the trauma of this, but I would encourage you to do so because I think that there's a way in which the temporal mapping of this can sort of coincide with, I think you all wrote the introduction as I was reading in 2023. It can map onto what people's understanding of the pandemic as the time when they were afraid of COVID-19, right? Their psychological experience of the pandemic, which may have absolutely nothing to do with sort of the lived reality of COVID-19 in terms of the number of deaths or the number of cases, the amount of people who are routinely still being impacted from this. And so I wonder whether there is a way to think about how the COVID-19, which has become sort of normalized and routinized post 2023, which has corresponded with, the World Health Organization declared not that the pandemic was over as such, but that the global emergency was over. And that the measures that were in place during the global emergency didn't need to take place. But the World Health Organization sort of political decision to say, the global emergency is over, as well as other national emergency declarations sort of moving away, allowed then for the dismantling of this care budget that had been set up because, well, we're no longer in an emergency. And so since we're no longer in an emergency, all of the things that the state was doing or was required to do underneath this emergency posture are no longer required. And thinking about what that removal of those supports did to women. And so a lot of the chapters focus on sort of the period of lockdowns and how the disproportionate amount of labor that women have in the household in terms of managing the household, in addition to managing their jobs and inside and outside of the home and the stresses that played. And one of the things that I would be curious to see if you all are thinking about or have any appetite for, how once social supports that were put in place because there was this deemed emergency get taken away, how are the gendered effects of those social supports gone? And the other thing I would be curious about thinking more about is thinking about how there was this politics and continues to be this politics of sort of discarding within the COVID-19. COVID-19 is something that is only impacting high-risk individuals. It's only really the vulnerable, which is really premised on sort of ableist and eugenicist logics. And I want to see if there's a way to sort of tease something more there, because I think that there's a way in which historically women have been characterized as part of the vulnerable. And so how was the construction, or at least some women, certainly there's a racialized and class dynamics about like who was vulnerable within women and sort of who's hardy and the like. But there was this sort of pandemic of the unvaccinated rhetoric in the United States in particular, but vax and relax or whatever else, that this is really just about like old people who are disposable or people with a number of comorbidities who are also disposable, that I think can get lost in the sense that, COVID-19, how do we understand the COVID-19 pandemic? And I think your book gives us a portal to doing so. And one of the things that I am curious about thinking about is whether COVID-19 is about sort of the lived experience of those who had to deal with, sort of the trauma and working underneath different conditions. Is the pandemic about the experience of lockdowns? Is the pandemic about, the millions of people who died globally around the world who have been seemingly forgotten? Is the pandemic, so confirmed deaths around the world is, as of March 15th, it's over 7 million. Is the pandemic this mass disabling event that disability rights and disability justice activists have talked about, right? And so there's a way in which that certainly has an extremely gendered impact that I would want to see in a second volume that talks about how in a number of places, disabled peoples, vulnerable peoples end up functioning as the canaries in the coal mine. And the things that disabled rights activists were calling for in terms of improving their own quality of life and well-being were actually things that rendered more people safe. And so thinking about things like what are the disparate impact of remote work, which the volume talks about, but also thinking about how disabled activists have been calling for cleaner air filtration and other things which impact not just COVID-19 and flu and respiratory viruses, but also for those who suffer from allergies like myself and other things which would prevent sort of a work to sickness, school to sickness pipeline that certainly has a gendered impact. But there is a way in which the sort of routineness of sickness has been made quotidian by the pandemic, right? We anticipate that there is now sort of a baseline expectation of sort of routine sickness, and that we should all be rendered sick. And this is something that we have to just sort of do. And there's a way in which, as my colleague Jackie Dugard was talking about, there's a way in which this certainly plays into capitalist interests in terms of thinking about, okay, well, you don't have an institutional obligation to provide safer work and school environments because that would be too costly, perhaps in the short term. We have to return to this normal, and how the return to normal requires more of those who have been gendered, and that return to normal is also obscuring the ways in which the pandemic has rendered most of us more vulnerable than we were. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, I mean, long COVID, the incidence is over 400 million. And I don't know if you all have the appetite for this, but I would love a volume that is thinking about not just sort of COVID-19 as the temporal period that we understand as being sort of locked down, but the lived experience of having your quality of life reduced, and then navigating that in the gendered body that you have, or that society sort of puts on you, and still having to engage with those things. And so those are just some offerings for more. Again, the reward for good work is a desire for more. And I think that what you all have done here really is actually just like a phenomenal feat, because it gives us a language and tools for understanding so much about the world and about how both sex and gender influence health. And this multidisciplinary, multi-country analyses really is a boon for researchers who are thinking about how do we have a better, healthier world and life. And I just want to thank you for putting this resource into the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirley. have about 10, 15 minutes to have a conversation. I wanted to give Linda and Aziza time to respond, or a lot of questions were posed. I've been taking notes, but I'm sure you have too. Do you have thoughts you want to respond to? Or Jackie, want to start?
When is volume 2 coming?
Yeah, right.
That is exactly what I was going to say. That sounds like the question.
I could ask, because I was thinking, Jackie, that it would be nice to hear a little bit more about your chapter, if you'd be up for talking about it, or even like the transformations that happened in South Africa since, COVID has kind of been declared over, because a lot of what you wrote about is the intellectual property regime and sort of the activism around vaccine access. And I haven't actually looked into it. I'm curious to hear what's the legacy of this in this past few years?
Yeah, I think in South Africa, as elsewhere, we have struggled to build positively, to come out of the portal, rebuilding, rethinking. I think we've gone back, and similarly to hear some of the care support that was provided during the pandemic, for example, some social assistance grants, some moratoriums on eviction were all taken away again after the pandemic ceased to be a pandemic. And I think these are missteps, and I think there is litigation in South Africa about the withdrawal of the social assistance package, and I think there might be some success from the courts. Actually, I think something that has emerged a lot, and hopefully at this moment in the US gives some hope, is how courts can move into the space. But it's unfortunate to have to rely on courts. But I think that when politics fails, I think the overwhelming sense I have globally is that governance and politics has failed. And we have to really rethink that, rethink political parties. We have to, as I said, rethink nation states. And I'm hoping that, I'm hoping that we can get Matiangai to the point where we are all in this together. We certainly are not at the moment, but I do hope that solidarity, so I see it so important that, for example, South Africa is attempting to assert some sense of an international legal order, trying to push back against just power-based system. I find these things really important. It's swimming upstream, but I think it is so important in every dimension.
Did you have any further thoughts? Matiangai, I don't have any present plans to do a second volume, although that's not to say there's not another scholarly forum in which one could discuss some of the things short of a huge multi-year edited book. But some of the things you brought up are really important. And one of the challenges right now is we didn't have a unified narrative at the time about the pandemic, and we don't have one now. We have a president who rehired people who were let go for failing to be vaccinated. I mean, we have as you were saying, we're now staffing the government with a particular point of view about the pandemic. And so when we can't even agree about what the pandemic was, it makes it very difficult to learn lessons from it. And I think your point about lingering vulnerability and the very different experiences people had of the pandemic is also a very valuable point. I mean, one of our contributors is still dealing with long COVID, years after the fact of getting, or some people have COVID, it's like, oh yeah, it was no big deal. I was at home for a week. It's very multi-leveled experience. And one thing I would say is that one of the chapters in the book by two sociologists based in Rutgers, I believe, it looks at masculinities theory and how that impacted masking and vaccinations, and how it was the combination of partisanship and where one was on a masculinity scale about how men felt about wearing masks or vaccinating, because there's different conceptions of masculinity. On one level, you could be protective of people by masking and by getting vaccinated, but in another model of masculinity, of toughness, which we saw modeled in Trump term 1, right? You don't have to have a mask. It's wimpy or weak or whatever. Why should those agricultural workers complain, or those factory workers complain about going back into a factory without proper safety precautions? So there's lots of different dimensions to how to think about how some of things are happening. But I don't know if you have any appetite for doing a second volume or some other forum to discuss some of the things. And I think maybe this is a project Matange could take on. We join you. We join you.
Can I just, something that Maya said that maybe we could build on and then ask if the audience has any questions they would like to ask. No pressure, but of course we would like to answer your questions. Is about where the resilience that was built during COVID has remained, or where the opportunities during COVID are sort of. So if we take the idea of the portal or the window pane, sort of we learned something about, and then we built strategies. So you talked about telehealth, for example, and I think I'm looking for more examples, and I'm wondering if the room has more examples.
Well, movement building, I think. We saw some, pretty striking examples of movement building at that time. I mean, obviously, we've gone far from, the initial response to the murder of George Floyd, and now we've swung back in completely the opposite direction with the anti-DEI. But there was a period, that showed us people could get together on, marching on the streets and call for some change. I think we've seen that in a certain regard with the state level abortion ballot initiatives. Like, we've seen a lot of successful action there. So I think there's a bit of hope and a sense of, both resistance and resilience from some of that movement building action we saw during the pandemic.
Okay. I wanted a longer list, but that's fine.
I think it's going to solve everything.
Oh, right.
Yes.
No, I mean, from my small corner of the world in IP,
Movements.
and sharing of information, the vaccine development was actually, the first of its kind in the world, and part of that was because we shared information, and the companies stopped their IP protection, and there was this collaboration. So, things are possible when property is reimagined, Jackie. Very much so. Any other? I would like to, if people had questions. Does anyone in the audience want to ask questions of the authors?
Or offer comments.
There's one more you just made me realize.
Oh, yeah?
About property. Universal basic income.
Oh,
UBI. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we basically did it for a short period.
We did
right?
do it for a
so
short
it's
period.
okay, that's possible.
And we did paid leave for the
Yeah.
first
Paid
time.
leave.
And that's what I'm talking about.
Federal
So in
paid
South
leave.
Africa, that was provided then taken away. And I mean, this is what is really interesting to me is that Elon Musk originally had the idea many years ago about exactly this, that AI was going to take over all the jobs and we should give everybody universal basic income. Yeah.
If only we had been listening to him.
Then, you see, we did not. The left rejected him, and see where we've got. Don't reject men.
That's the lesson.
Yeah.
It's funny. We can be funny on a Friday. Yeah.
Well, I don't think we would have previously done these hybrid conferences before the pandemic.
Right.
We've expanded ways to communicate.
No, for sure. That's a
new forms of connection through, online communities.
Yeah, for sure. I different think, and also it builds new kinds of solidarities when you can do that.
I think I don't have a well-formulated question, but I was thinking about Maya's comment about, you have to go beyond the law. And I feel like, too, we're seeing that so vividly in the abortion space, where people are just kind of like, I'm going to do this, you know what I mean, whether or not you want me to. And I feel like there's something about the relationship between, ourselves and legality and lawfulness that shifted in the abortion rights space. And I don't know that it's directly related to COVID, but how could it not be? Because, we were all experiencing that so profoundly, in the sense that we were going to open up these services to people, and we were going to get medication abortion to people no matter what the circumstance was. I just had Francine Coito, who runs Plan C, which is an online organization where you can order medication abortion in my class. And, it was really funny to hear her talk to a bunch of law students saying, like, I don't like lawyers, I don't want law students, I don't want anyone to tell me I can't do it because it's against the law. That's kind of this should be legal, and I'm gonna keep doing it. It was this kind of way of living in the world that feels new to me for the reproductive rights.
Because we've been all hooked on constitutional rights and constitutional law and not thinking about access.
Right. It's of course the framework for which people who are fighting for their freedom almost always operated under, though, right? So the kind of oppression that one feels when abortion is outlawed and then you just have to do it at any cost is definitely how people who are enslaved or colonized often felt like when they had to exert their freedom. And so what I think about when you think about that is how there's a clarity that comes with an oppression of what must be a human right. You do it at any cost because otherwise you're not a person, right?
I wonder though if people feel like one thing the pandemic did, because so many of us felt like we're on our own with our health, we have to protect our own health. I wonder if in some ways it did leave us with a feeling of legitimating taking care of our own health. Like it's not this crazy thing to self-manage an abortion or do other things, because we're all just sort of
the director of the CDC said it. She said, your health is in your hands. Remember she stood up and she made this announcement at one point, she's like, you take care of yourself, people. And
which director of
the back in the
Rochelle Walensky.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Matiangai, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that there is, one of the things really the only thing that gives me hope in this moment and in past is thinking about social movements. And I was thinking about the work that HIV/AIDS activists did to move the Overton window around access to essential medicines, and thinking about people for profit and the like, and the resistance that campaign faced by the U.S. Through a number of different threatened lawsuits and whatever else, and then thinking about the move for the people's vaccine for COVID-19, and the very slight shift of the Biden administration to not oppose relaxing intellectual property protections as it relates to vaccines and vaccines only. And then South Africa and India's push in the World Trade Organization to try to open up the tech and open up the knowledge production around essential medicines, therapeutics, and the like for COVID-19. And I think that, building each sort of movement, building on the last, is pushing powerful actors and interests to have to face challenges that are real ones in terms of thinking about access to essential medicines. And we see this in times of crisis, but this is something that is a reality in the normal times as well, right? And so there's a way in which we can see the lens of a crisis. The pandemic is a portal to also questioning, okay, well, why is it also not the case that in regular times I have to go travel across state lines or country lines or whatever to get cheaper insulin, right? There's a way of thinking about access to essential medicines in times of crisis as well as non-crisis times, because it should be about prioritizing our health needs. And so the pandemic has given us another space to push on that. And I think that is something that is, a continual space for more transformation, but at least it is something that is a legacy.
Thank you. I do see Jim Fleming's hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Jim? Yeah, maybe you wait for the microphone. You'll get one question and one answer, and then we'll clap us out.
So during the pandemic, occasionally I would encounter an argument along the following lines. a possible silver lining of the pandemic is that support for an affirmative, supportive government is up.
Yeah.
People see the benefits of an affirmative, supportive government. And whenever, and so I wonder if you think there is anything of that lingers, or is the view that, well, with once the emergency was declared over, that we go back to where we were and we hate government again, rather than learning from the experience. I know that one thing related to this is the narratives that people construct about the pandemic, because I think the recognition of an affirmative, supportive government gets wiped out in complaints about, about masking, and complaints about closing of businesses and the like. And also, it seems that sometimes, like, Trump is trying to obliterate any vestige. I mean, even like forbidding federal workers to work remotely. I think that it's partly that he just wants to obliterate any vestige of any change wrought by the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think some of the issues that we're seeing now to kind of reveal the problems of a progressive reticence early on in the pandemic to sort of make any room for the type of critique that would allow for us to say, well, maybe the support of government isn't always good. Because I think what progressives did during the pandemic was to say, retreat into like a pro-government, pro-vaccine, and there's a lot of questions and doubts that are valid questions and doubts about that kind of big government approach to public health. There's skepticism from the Black community about vaccines that's legitimate. There's skepticism from people who believe that the FDA is sort of in bed with pharma. There are legitimate critiques that a lot of people on the left would make otherwise. And I think in some ways, this isn't directly responsive, but in some ways, I think what we're seeing now is that the like sort of conservative, libertarian type of response in the context of public health is being generated by the lack of space that was made for any sort of critique in that particular moment in which the right thing to do was to stick out your arm and get a shot, no matter who was putting what was going into your arm, and support the government and support public health and stay at home and do what the government says. And I think it does engender a really real fear and legitimate fear many times, and we just didn't make room for that. And I feel like what we're seeing now is partly a reaction to that. It's like that little seed that got planted that never was addressed properly. I don't know if
That resonates.
yeah.
All right. We need to call it an afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your spring day. Thank you for sticking it out here. And for everyone online, thank you for joining us.